Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah. And 6 months ago, my cousin Marcus tried to steal my inheritance by claiming our grandfather's 200-acre farm in Iowa was worthless and that I should sign it over to him for a few $1,000s. What Marcus didn't know was that while he was busy trying to manipulate me into giving up my birthright, I had just discovered something hidden in the old barn that would change everything we thought we knew about Grandpa William's simple corn and soybean operation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. See, Marcus thought he was so clever, but when I found those sealed containers buried beneath the hay storage and realized what Grandpa had really been cultivating all those years, Marcus's greedy smile disappeared real quick. The morning everything changed started like any other Wednesday in my downtown Chicago marketing office. I was reviewing quarterly reports for a pharmaceutical client when my phone rang with a call from Williamson Associates, a law firm in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. The receptionist's voice was formal but gentle as she informed me that I needed to attend a will reading for my recently deceased grandfather, William Patterson. I hadn't spoken to Grandpa William in almost 2 years, not since the awkward Christmas dinner where my cousin Marcus had gotten into a heated argument with him about modernizing the farm operation. At the time, I'd assumed it was just another family disagreement about farming techniques and business practices. Grandpa had always been stubborn about maintaining traditional methods on his 200-acre property, while Marcus constantly pushed for industrial-scale changes that would maximize short-term profits. The drive from Chicago to Cedar Rapids took me through familiar Iowa countryside, past endless fields of corn and soybeans that stretched to the horizon under a pale October sky. I'd made this journey countless times during my childhood, spending summers at Grandpa's farm learning to drive tractors, collect eggs from the chicken coop, and help with harvest seasons that felt like magical celebrations of hard work and natural abundance. But those childhood visits had become less frequent as I'd gotten older, focused on college, career advancement, and building a life in the city that felt increasingly disconnected from my rural roots. The guilt of that distance hit me as I pulled into the parking lot of the law firm, realizing that Grandpa had died without me ever properly thanking him for the values and work ethic he instilled in me during those formative summer months. Attorney James Williamson was a man in his 60s with kind eyes and the careful demeanor of someone who had spent decades helping families navigate grief and complicated inheritances. His office walls were lined with agricultural law books and framed photographs of Iowa farmland, suggesting deep familiarity with the unique challenges facing rural families and their property distributions. "Miss Patterson," he said as I settled into the leather chair across from his desk, "I want to express my condolences on your grandfather's passing. William was a remarkable man who spoke of you often during our meetings over the past year." I was surprised to learn that Grandpa had been meeting regularly with an attorney, given his lifelong skepticism of lawyers and legal complications. During my childhood, he'd always handled business matters with handshake agreements and simple contracts, trusting people's word more than written documentation. "Your grandfather made some significant changes to his will during his final months," Williamson continued, opening a thick folder that contained multiple legal documents. He was very specific about his intentions and wanted to ensure that his property would be protected and preserved according to his values. The first surprise was learning that Marcus, who had always positioned himself as Grandpa's obvious heir and had spent years talking about his plans for expanding and modernizing the farm operation, had been left only $10,000 and a small storage shed on the edge of the property. The amount was generous enough to avoid appearing vindictive, but clearly insufficient to fund the ambitious development projects Marcus had been planning. The second surprise was discovering that I had inherited the entire farm, 200 acres of prime Iowa agricultural land, the century-old farmhouse where Grandpa had lived his entire adult life, and all the outbuildings,
including the massive red barn that had been the centerpiece of the property for 3 generations. The inheritance also included farming equipment, livestock, and what the will described as all crops, seeds, and agricultural materials currently stored on the property. Your grandfather was very concerned about preserving the farm's traditional character and environmental sustainability, Williamson explained as I stared at the documents in disbelief. He felt strongly that the property should remain in the hands of someone who would respect its history and continue his conservation practices rather than someone focused primarily on profit maximization. The responsibility felt overwhelming. I knew nothing about running a farming operation, had no experience with agricultural business management, and lived 200 miles away in a city apartment. My career in marketing had given me skills in communication and strategic planning, but nothing that seemed directly applicable to corn and soybean production. "There's one more thing," Williamson said, pulling out a sealed envelope with my name written in Grandpa's distinctive handwriting. "William asked me to give you this letter after the formal will reading. He said it contained important information about the property that you would need to know as the new owner." The letter was 3 pages long, written in the careful cursive that Grandpa had learned in a one-room schoolhouse during the Depression. His words carried the weight of final instructions and deep affection, but also hints of mystery that left me with more questions than answers. "My dear Sarah," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're probably feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility I've placed on your shoulders. I want you to know that I chose you as my heir not because of family obligation, but because you have the integrity and curiosity necessary to continue the work I've been doing on this land for the past 30 years. The letter continued with specific instructions about property maintenance, seasonal farming schedules, and the importance of maintaining relationships with neighboring farmers who had been helpful and supportive throughout his years of independent operation. But it was the final paragraph that made my hands tremble as I read, "Sarah, there are aspects of the farm operation that I never discussed with the family because I was afraid they wouldn't understand the importance of the work. In the old barn beneath the hay storage area, you'll find containers that represent the most valuable part of your inheritance. This discovery will help you understand why I was so insistent about keeping the property within the family and why certain people must never be allowed to control what I've spent decades protecting." The letter concluded with a hand-drawn map showing the exact location within the barn where I should begin my search, along with a key taped to the back of the final page. Grandpa had clearly anticipated that his death would bring challenges and had taken steps to ensure I would have the information necessary to protect whatever he had been hiding. As I drove back toward the farm that was now legally mine, I felt a mixture of grief, excitement, and apprehension about what I might discover in the barn. The property looked exactly as I remembered from childhood visits. The white farmhouse with its wraparound porch, the red barn with weather-faded paint, and fields that stretched toward tree lines marking the boundaries with neighboring properties. The key from Grandpa's letter opened a small storage room in the barn's northeast corner, a space I'd never noticed during my childhood explorations. Inside, beneath layers of hay bales that had clearly been carefully arranged to conceal what lay beneath, I found 12 large plastic containers with tight-fitting lids and labels written in Grandpa's methodical handwriting. The containers held seeds unlike anything I'd ever seen, varieties that looked similar to corn and soybeans, but with subtle differences in color, size, and texture. Each container was labeled with scientific names, cultivation dates, and notes about growing conditions that used terminology I didn't recognize. There were also detailed journals documenting decades of careful crossbreeding, genetic selection, and environmental testing. As I read through Grandpa's meticulous records, I began to understand that he hadn't been running a simple farming operation at all. For 30 years, he had been developing drought-resistant, high-yield crop varieties specifically designed to thrive in changing climate conditions. His work represented decades of patient scientific research conducted in secret, away from agricultural corporations that would have tried to patent and commercialize his discoveries. The implications were staggering. These weren't just family heirloom seeds, they were potentially revolutionary agricultural innovations that could help farmers adapt to climate change while maintaining sustainable growing practices. But Grandpa's secrecy made perfect sense when I considered the corporate consolidation that had been transforming agriculture throughout his lifetime. Large companies had been buying up family farms, patenting seed varieties, and forcing farmers to purchase new seeds every season rather than saving and replanting from their own harvests. Grandpa had been protecting his research from exactly that kind of exploitation. The discovery explained so many things that had puzzled me about his final years. The regular visits from university researchers who claimed to be studying traditional farming methods, the mysterious greenhouse he'd built behind the barn and kept locked, and his fierce resistance to Marcus's suggestions about modernizing the operation with corporate partnerships and industrial farming techniques. Marcus had been pushing for changes that would have exposed or destroyed exactly what Grandpa had been working to protect. His plans for large-scale monoculture farming, pesticide applications, and genetic modification partnerships would have contaminated or eliminated the carefully developed seed varieties that represented 3 decades of scientific work. As I sat in the barn surrounded by containers that held the future of sustainable agriculture, I realized that inheriting this farm meant inheriting a responsibility much larger than property ownership. I was now the guardian of scientific research that could help feed the world while protecting the environment, and I was the only thing standing between Grandpa's life's work and people who would exploit it for short-term profit. The weight of that responsibility was both terrifying and inspiring. I had no agricultural experience, no scientific training, and no idea how to continue Grandpa's research or protect it from commercial exploitation. But I also had the integrity and curiosity he mentioned in his letter, and along with a growing determination to honor his legacy by learning what I needed to know.
The next morning brought an unwelcome visitor to my newfound inheritance. I was in the farmhouse kitchen, trying to make sense of Grandpa's detailed cultivation journals over coffee, when I heard the distinctive rumble of Marcus's lifted Ford truck pulling into the gravel driveway. Through the window, I watched my cousin climb out wearing his usual uniform of designer jeans, expensive boots, and a polo shirt that screamed suburban success rather than agricultural knowledge. Marcus had always been the family member who talked the biggest game about farming, while having the least actual experience with dirt under his fingernails. At 35, he worked as a regional sales manager for an agricultural equipment company, a job that gave him just enough industry knowledge to sound authoritative, while lacking the practical wisdom that came from actually working the land. He knocked on the front door with the confident rhythm of someone who expected to be welcomed, despite the fact that we hadn't spoken since that disastrous Christmas dinner 2 years ago. When I opened the door, his smile was too wide and his enthusiasm too forced, like a salesman approaching a particularly valuable prospect. "Sarah, cousin, I heard about Grandpa William and wanted to come by to offer my condolences," he said, pushing past me into the living room without waiting for an invitation. "I also thought we should talk about this whole inheritance situation before you make any decisions you might regret." The presumption in his tone immediately put me on guard. Marcus had a lifelong pattern of treating family conversations like business negotiations, always angling for advantages while pretending to offer helpful advice. His presence in the farmhouse felt invasive, like he was already calculating square footage and property values. "What decisions are you talking about, Marcus?" I asked, remaining standing while he made himself comfortable on Grandpa's old recliner. The will was pretty clear about Grandpa's intentions. He laughed in the condescending way he'd perfected during our childhood, the sound that always preceded him explaining why my perspective was naive or uninformed. "Come on, Sarah. You live in Chicago. You work in marketing. What are you going to do with 200 acres of farmland? You can't just abandon your career to play farmer." His dismissive attitude toward farming as playing revealed everything I needed to know about his respect for Grandpa's life's work. Marcus had always viewed the farm as an underutilized asset rather than a meaningful legacy, seeing dollar signs where Grandpa had seen generations of careful stewardship and environmental responsibility. "Look, I've been thinking about this situation for months," Marcus continued, pulling out his phone to show me what appeared to be preliminary property assessments and development plans. The land alone is worth at least $800,000, maybe more if we can get agricultural zoning changed for residential development. The farmhouse is charming but outdated, and the outbuildings are basically worthless. His casual mention of zoning changes in residential development made my stomach clench. Marcus wasn't just talking about selling the farm, he was talking about destroying it completely, converting productive agricultural land into suburban housing developments that would eliminate decades of soil conservation and environmental protection work. Marcus, the farm, Grandpa specifically left it to me because he wanted it preserved as agricultural land. He trusted me to continue his work, not to sell it to developers. His work? He scoffed. Sarah, Grandpa was growing corn and soybeans like every other farmer in Iowa. There's nothing special or irreplaceable about this operation. You're romanticizing a simple farming business because you feel guilty about not visiting more often. The cruel accuracy of his guilt observations stung, but his dismissal of Grandpa's work as simple farming revealed just how little he understood about what had really been happening on this property. If Marcus had no idea about the seed research and agricultural innovation hidden in the barn, then Grandpa's secrecy had been even more necessary than I'd realized. I've already talked to several agricultural real estate agents, Marcus said, scrolling through his phone contacts with the confidence of someone who believed his plans were inevitable. With current land prices and development potential, we could easily clear $1.2 million after taxes and legal fees. Split between us, that's $600,000 each, enough for you to buy a nice condo in Chicago and invest the rest for retirement. The casual way he assumed we would split the inheritance that had been legally left entirely to me was breathtaking in its presumption. Marcus had always operated under the assumption that family assets belonged to whoever was most aggressive about claiming them, regardless of actual ownership or legal documentation. Marcus, the farm isn't for sale, I said firmly. Grandpa left it specifically to me, and I intend to honor his wishes by keeping it as working agricultural land. His expression shifted from confident salesmanship to barely contained irritation, the mask slipping to reveal the entitlement and resentment that had always driven his interactions with family members who didn't automatically defer to his authority. "You're being incredibly selfish, Sarah," he said, standing up and pacing around the living room like he owned it. "This inheritance affects the whole family, not just you. I've been managing family finances and property investments for years, and I have the experience necessary to maximize the value of Grandpa's estate." The claim about managing family finances was particularly galling, since Marcus had no legal authority over anyone else's money, and his own financial track record included a failed restaurant investment and a series of get-rich-quick schemes that had cost him thousands of dollars in losses.
"Besides," Marcus continued, his voice taking on the wheedling tone he used when logical arguments weren't working, "you don't have any idea what's involved in running a farming operation. The equipment maintenance alone costs thousands of dollars every year, not to mention seed, fertilizer, labor, and insurance. You'll go bankrupt within 2 seasons trying to figure out agricultural business management." His predictions about farming costs and challenges weren't entirely wrong, but they revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of why Grandpa had chosen me as his heir. The inheritance wasn't about agricultural expertise or business management experience. It was about character, values, and commitment to protecting something larger than immediate financial gain. "Marcus, I appreciate your concern about the practical challenges," I said, though his concern felt more like intimidation tactics. "But Grandpa obviously believed I could handle the responsibility. Maybe you should trust his judgment instead of trying to undermine his final wishes." The mention of respecting Grandpa's judgment clearly hit a nerve, because Marcus's face flushed with the same anger I remembered from childhood arguments when he couldn't get his way through manipulation and had to resort to more direct confrontation. Grandpa was 87 years old and hadn't been thinking clearly for months before he died. He was isolated out here, probably developing dementia, and obviously influenced by whoever spent the most time with him during his final weeks. The accusation that I had somehow manipulated a vulnerable elderly man was both insulting and revealing. Marcus couldn't accept that Grandpa had made rational decisions based on character assessment, so he had to create alternative explanations that preserved his sense of entitlement to the inheritance. "That's a serious accusation, Marcus," I said coldly. "Are you suggesting that Grandpa's attorney allowed him to make major legal decisions while mentally incompetent? Because that would raise questions about the entire will, including your own inheritance." The threat to his $10,000 bequest seemed to register, because Marcus stepped back from the dementia claims and tried a different approach. He pulled out a folder containing what appeared to be property appraisals, development proposals, and financial projections. "Look, Sarah, I'm trying to help you make a smart decision here," he said, spreading documents across Grandpa's coffee table like he was conducting a business presentation. "I've already done the preliminary research on maximizing this property's value. We could probably get zoning approval for a residential subdivision within 18 months, maybe sooner if we work with the right developers." The documents revealed just how much planning Marcus had been doing during Grandpa's final months, apparently counting on inheriting the farm and immediately converting it to commercial use. His preliminary research included soil surveys, utility access studies, and preliminary architectural drawings for a housing development called Patterson Meadows. "You've been planning this for months," I said, flipping through documents that were dated before Grandpa's death. "You were so certain you'd inherit the farm that you already started the development process?" Marcus had the grace to look slightly embarrassed, but he quickly recovered his composure and tried to frame his premature planning as prudent preparation rather than presumptuous entitlement. "I was trying to be responsible about estate planning. Grandpa was old and sick, and somebody needed to think about maximizing the family's financial interests. I was protecting our inheritance from being wasted on outdated farming practices." The conversation continued for another hour, with Marcus alternating between financial pressure, emotional manipulation, and barely veiled threats about legal challenges to the will. He suggested that my inexperience with farming would lead to financial ruin, that keeping the property would be selfish toward other family members, and that Grandpa's final wishes had been influenced by age-related confusion rather than rational decision-making. But the more Marcus talked, the more I understood why Grandpa had been so specific about his inheritance decisions. Marcus saw the farm as a collection of assets to be liquidated for maximum profit, while Grandpa saw it as a living legacy that required protection from exactly that kind of short-term thinking. "Marcus, I'm not going to change my mind about selling the farm," I said, standing up to signal that the conversation was over. "Grandpa left me this property because he trusted me to preserve it, and that's exactly what I'm going to do." His response was swift and revealing. "Fine, Sarah. But when you're struggling to pay property taxes and equipment costs, don't come crying to the family for financial help. And when you realize you're in over your head with farming responsibilities, don't expect me to bail you out." The threat was clear enough. Marcus intended to withhold any family support that might help me succeed as a farmer, hoping that financial pressure would eventually force me to sell the property to him at a reduced price. His strategy relied on isolating me from family resources while creating artificial urgency around financial challenges. After Marcus left, I sat in the quiet farmhouse trying to process the emotional weight of family betrayal and the practical challenges ahead. His visit had clarified several important things. He had no idea about Grandpa's secret research work. He was willing to destroy the farm's agricultural character for short-term profit, and he would actively work to undermine my success as the new owner. But Marcus's threats had also strengthened my resolve to protect what Grandpa had built. The seed varieties hidden in the barn represented decades of scientific work that could benefit farmers around the world, and they were now my responsibility to safeguard from people who would exploit them without understanding their true value. That evening, I returned to the barn to continue studying Grandpa's research journals, trying to understand the full scope of what I had inherited. His meticulous records revealed not just seed development work, but an entire philosophy of sustainable agriculture that prioritized long-term soil health, biodiversity protection, and climate adaptation over maximum yield and profit. The more I learned about Grandpa's scientific work, the more I understood that Marcus's development plans would destroy something truly irreplaceable. The soil conditions, microclimates, and ecological relationships that Grandpa had spent 30 years cultivating couldn't be recreated somewhere else or purchased with development profits. As I locked the barn and walked back to the farmhouse under a star-filled Iowa sky, I realized that protecting Grandpa's legacy would require not just learning to farm, but learning to fight against people who viewed land as nothing more than a commodity to be exploited. Marcus had revealed his intentions clearly enough, and I would need to be prepared for whatever tactics he might use to pressure me into abandoning my inheritance. The battle for the farm had officially begun, and I was determined to prove worthy of the trust Grandpa had placed in me, regardless of the challenges ahead. The next few days brought a crash course in agricultural reality that was both overwhelming and eye-opening. I'd taken emergency leave from my marketing job in Chicago, claiming a family emergency that required extended time in Iowa. My boss, Jennifer, had been understanding, but made it clear that my absence couldn't stretch indefinitely without jeopardizing my position with the pharmaceutical client. Standing in Grandpa's kitchen at dawn, surrounded by farming journals and seed catalogs I couldn't fully understand, I realized how naive I'd been about the complexity of agricultural operations. Marcus's warnings about equipment costs and maintenance weren't entirely wrong. The responsibility was enormous, and the learning curve steep. But it was Dr. Elena Rodriguez who changed everything. She appeared at my door on Thursday morning, a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and hands that showed the calluses of someone who worked with soil and plants. Her pickup truck was dusty from rural roads, and her clothing was the functional attire of someone who spent more time in greenhouses than offices. "You must be Sarah," she said, with a warm smile that immediately put me at ease. "I'm Elena Rodriguez from Iowa State University's Agricultural Research Department. I was a colleague of your grandfather's. I'm sorry for your loss. William was an extraordinary man and a brilliant researcher." The word colleague caught my attention immediately. Grandpa had never mentioned working with university researchers, at least not in any formal capacity. But Dr. Rodriguez's genuine grief and obvious respect suggested a relationship that went far deeper than casual acquaintance. "Dr. Rodriguez, I'm confused," I said, inviting her into the farmhouse. "Grandpa never mentioned university collaborations. As far as I knew, he was just farming corn and soybeans like everyone else in the county." Her laugh was gentle but knowing. William was incredibly protective of his research, and for good reason. What he was developing here had the potential to revolutionize sustainable agriculture, but he was terrified that commercial interests would steal his work before it could benefit small farmers. She pulled out a thick folder containing what appeared to be scientific papers, correspondence, and research proposals. The documents revealed a hidden aspect of Grandpa's life that I had never suspected. He had been conducting cutting-edge agricultural research in partnership with university scientists, developing drought-resistant and climate-adaptive crop varieties that could help farmers survive increasingly unpredictable weather patterns. "Your grandfather was essentially running an unofficial research station," Dr. Rodriguez explained as she spread documents across the kitchen table. "He had perfect soil conditions, ideal microclimates, and enough space to conduct long-term field trials that would have been impossible on university land with bureaucratic restrictions." The partnership had been deliberately informal to protect Grandpa's intellectual property rights and prevent corporate interference. University researchers provided scientific expertise and laboratory analysis, while Grandpa provided land, practical farming knowledge, and the patience necessary for multi-generational crop development projects. "We've been working together for 15 years, Dr. Rodriguez continued, her voice carrying the weight of professional respect and personal friendship. "William developed seed varieties that could survive drought conditions that would kill conventional crops, soybeans that actually improve soil quality while producing higher yields, and corn varieties specifically adapted to the climate changes we're already seeing in the Midwest." She showed me photographs of test plots on Grandpa's land that I had walked past countless times during childhood visits, without recognizing their significance. Areas that I'd assumed were just unusually healthy crops had actually been experimental fields where Grandpa was testing genetic modifications achieved through traditional crossbreeding rather than laboratory manipulation. The work your grandfather was doing here represents 20 years of patient scientific research, Dr. Rodriguez said, pulling out yield comparisons and soil health studies that documented remarkable improvements in both productivity and environmental sustainability. But it was the folder marked corporate interest that explained Grandpa's secrecy and made my hands tremble as I read through the contents. Several major agricultural corporations had apparently been trying for years to acquire Grandpa's land, not because they understood his research, but because soil surveys and satellite analysis had revealed unusually high productivity and soil quality that they wanted to study and potentially exploit. Agrimax Corporation has been particularly aggressive, Dr. Rodriguez said, pointing to a series of increasingly insistent letters offering to purchase the farm at above market prices. They've been buying up family farms throughout Iowa, claiming to preserve traditional agriculture while actually consolidating land for industrial-scale operations. The letters revealed a pattern of corporate behavior that was both sophisticated and predatory. Agrimax would approach family farmers with generous offers, emphasizing the financial security and freedom from agricultural responsibilities that selling would provide. Once they acquired properties, they would implement intensive farming methods that maximized short-term yields while depleting soil quality and eliminating biodiversity.
What's particularly concerning, Dr. Rodriguez continued, is that Agrimax has been specifically targeting farms with exceptional soil quality or unusual crop performance. They're essentially trying to acquire the results of traditional farming wisdom without understanding or preserving the methods that created those results. She showed me satellite images comparing Grandpa's land to neighboring properties, highlighting the stark differences in soil health, water retention, and crop productivity that his sustainable methods had achieved over decades of careful stewardship. The contrast was dramatic enough that agricultural scientists had been studying the property for years, trying to understand the techniques that created such exceptional results. Your grandfather knew that if Agrimax acquired this land, they would destroy everything he'd built within a few seasons, Dr. Rodriguez said. They would rip out the hedgerows that provide habitat for beneficial insects, eliminate the crop rotation patterns that maintain soil fertility, and plant genetically modified varieties that would contaminate his carefully developed seed lines. The conversation continued for 3 hours, with Dr. Rodriguez explaining the scientific significance of Grandpa's work and the threats it faced from corporate consolidation. She also offered practical support for continuing the research and maintaining the sustainable farming practices that had made the property so valuable to the scientific community. Sarah, I want to be completely honest with you about what you've inherited, she said, as our conversation drew to a close. This isn't just a farm, it's a living laboratory that could help agriculture adapt to climate change while protecting soil and water resources for future generations. But it's also a target for people who see land as nothing more than an asset to be exploited. That afternoon, Dr. Rodriguez took me on a detailed tour of the property, pointing out features and systems that I had never noticed despite decades of childhood visits. The seemingly random patches of wildflowers were actually carefully planned pollinator habitats that supported beneficial insects essential for crop production. The trees that I'd thought were simply windbreaks were actually part of an agroforestry system that improved soil quality while providing wildlife habitat. Most importantly, she showed me the greenhouse behind the barn where Grandpa had been conducting his most sensitive research. The structure was larger and more sophisticated than I'd realized, containing controlled environment chambers, seed storage systems, and detailed record-keeping equipment that documented every aspect of his experimental work. This greenhouse represents the heart of your grandpa's research program, Dr. Rodriguez explained, as we examined rows of carefully labeled plants in various stages of development. Some of these seed lines have been in development for over a decade, with each generation selected for specific traits like drought tolerance, disease resistance, and soil improvement capabilities.
She handed me a binder containing detailed protocols for maintaining the research program, including planting schedules, data collection requirements, and quality control measures that ensured the scientific validity of ongoing experiments. The complexity was intimidating, but Dr. Rodriguez assured me that the university partnership could provide training and support to help me continue Grandpa's work. The most important thing right now is protecting the seed varieties your grandfather developed, she said, as we led to a climate-controlled storage room containing hundreds of carefully labeled containers. These seeds represent genetic resources that could be lost forever if they're not properly maintained and propagated. That evening, as Dr. Rodriguez prepared to leave, she handed me her business card along with contact information for other university researchers who had been collaborating with Grandpa. She also warned me about the importance of maintaining discretion about the research program until I was better prepared to handle corporate pressure and potential attempts at intellectual property theft. Sarah, your grandfather trusted you with something truly valuable, but you should know that there are people who would do almost anything to get their hands on his research. Be careful about who you trust, and don't let anyone pressure you into making quick decisions about the property. After she left, I sat on the farmhouse porch as the sun set over fields that I now understood were far more valuable and significant than I had ever imagined. The weight of responsibility felt enormous. I was the guardian of 20 years of scientific research that could help feed the world while protecting the environment. But I was also the target of corporate interests and family members who saw the land as nothing more than a financial asset to be liquidated for maximum profit. Marcus's development plans would destroy everything Grandpa had built, while Agrimax's industrial farming methods would eliminate decades of soil improvement and biodiversity conservation. The phone rang as I was processing these revelations, and Marcus's voice carried a smugness that immediately put me on guard. Sarah, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I want to make you an offer that's more generous than anything you'll get from outside buyers. His tone suggested that he believed financial pressure and isolation would eventually force me to accept his terms, regardless of my initial resistance to selling the farm. But he had no idea about the scientific research I'd just discovered, or the university partnerships that could provide support for continuing Grandpa's work. Marcus, I told you yesterday that the farm isn't for sale, I said firmly. Nothing has changed since then. Actually, Sarah, I think you'll find that a lot has changed, he replied with the confidence of someone who believed he held trump cards. I've been talking to some agricultural real estate experts, and they've raised some interesting questions about the property's legal status and your ability to maintain agricultural operations without proper experience. The implied trait was clear enough. Marcus was preparing some kind of legal or administrative challenge to my ownership or my ability to operate the farm. But his timing couldn't have been worse from his perspective, since I now had university partnerships and scientific documentation that proved the property's extraordinary value and importance.
As I hung up the phone and locked the farmhouse for the night, I realized that the battle for Grandpa's legacy was about to escalate in ways I hadn't anticipated. Marcus was planning something more sophisticated than simple family pressure, while corporate interests were circling like vultures waiting for an opportunity to acquire valuable agricultural land. But I was no longer the unprepared city dweller that Marcus assumed he could intimidate into submission. I had allies in the scientific community, documentation of the property's true value, and a growing understanding of what Grandpa had trusted me to protect. The war for the farm was entering a new phase, and I was determined to prove worthy of the responsibility I'd inherited, regardless of the forces arrayed against me. Marcus's threat materialized faster than I had anticipated. Monday morning brought a certified letter from Patterson Associates, a Des Moines law firm I'd never heard of, containing a formal legal challenge to my agricultural operations. The document was dense with legal terminology, but the basic message was clear. Marcus was claiming that I lacked the proper licensing, experience, and financial resources to operate a commercial farming enterprise. The lawsuit alleged that my inexperience posed risks to neighboring properties through potential pesticide misuse, equipment accidents, and failure to maintain proper drainage systems.
More significantly, it claimed that allowing an unqualified urban professional to manage agricultural operations violated county zoning requirements and endangered the local farming community. What made the legal challenge particularly sophisticated was its focus on technical regulations rather than inheritance law. Marcus couldn't contest Grandpa's will directly, so he was attacking my ability to actually use the property for its intended purpose. If successful, the suit would force me to either hire expensive farm management services or sell the land to someone with appropriate agricultural credentials. I called Dr. Rodriguez immediately, my hands shaking as I read through the legal documents. Her response was swift and reassuring, but also revealed the broader scope of what I was facing. Sarah, this is exactly the kind of pressure tactic that AgriMax Corporation has been using against family farmers throughout Iowa, she said after I'd read the lawsuit details over the phone. They identify properties they want to acquire, then create legal and financial pressure that forces owners to sell rather than fight expensive court battles. She explained that Marcus was likely being coached or even financially supported by corporate interests who saw the lawsuit as an investment in acquiring valuable agricultural land. The legal fees for defending against such challenges could easily exceed $50,000, an amount that would strain most family budgets and create exactly the financial pressure that made selling seem like the only rational option. The good news is that you're not fighting this alone, Dr. Rodriguez continued. Iowa State University has been documenting cases of corporate land grabbing, and we have legal resources specifically designed to help family farmers defend against frivolous lawsuits. I'm going to connect you with our agricultural law clinic. That afternoon brought an unexpected ally in the form of Margaret Chen, a sharp-eyed attorney in her 40s who specialized in agricultural law and corporate accountability. She arrived at the farm driving a practical Honda Civic and wearing clothing that suggested someone who spent time in courtrooms but wasn't intimidated by rural settings. Miss Patterson, I've been following corporate acquisition patterns in this region for several years. Your cousin's legal challenge has all the hallmarks of a coordinated corporate strategy designed to force family farmers off their land. Margaret spread out documents showing similar lawsuits filed against dozens of Iowa farmers over the past 3 years. The pattern was consistent. Family members or business partners would file technical compliance challenges, forcing property owners to choose between expensive legal battles or quick sales to corporate buyers who would then drop the lawsuits. AgriMax Corporation has been particularly active in this county, Margaret explained, pointing to a map showing properties they had acquired over the past 5 years. The pattern was dramatic and disturbing. Diverse crop rotations replaced by monoculture farming, hedgerows and windbreaks eliminated for larger field sizes, and obvious signs of soil degradation from intensive chemical applications. What's particularly concerning about your situation, Margaret continued, is that your property has been on the AgriMax target list for over 2 years. They've been monitoring soil quality, crop yields, and property values, waiting for an opportunity to acquire land that your grandfather spent decades improving. She pulled out a folder containing correspondence between AgriMax and local real estate agents, revealing that the corporation had been actively seeking ways to pressure Grandpa into selling during his final years. The letters discussed strategies for demonstrating that small-scale farming was economically unsustainable and that elderly farmers would benefit from transitioning to retirement-focused financial planning. Your grandfather was smart to keep his research program confidential, Margaret said. If AgriMax had known about the scientific work being conducted here, they would have been even more aggressive about acquiring the property. But the most shocking revelation came when Margaret showed me financial records indicating that Marcus had received a $25,000 consulting fee from AgriMax just 2 weeks before filing his lawsuit. The payment was officially for agricultural market analysis, but the timing made it clear that he was being compensated for creating legal pressure that would force me to sell the farm. "This is where we have them," Margaret said with satisfaction. "Your cousin failed to disclose his financial relationship with Agramax when filing the lawsuit. That's a serious ethical violation that could result in sanctions against him and his attorney, plus it completely undermines the credibility of his legal challenge."
The discovery that Marcus was essentially working as a corporate agent rather than acting out of family concern transformed my understanding of the situation. His pressure tactics, development plans, and legal challenges weren't just about inheritance disputes or financial opportunities. They were part of a coordinated corporate strategy to acquire valuable agricultural land. That evening, Margaret and I developed a comprehensive defense strategy that went beyond simply responding to Marcus's lawsuit. We would file counterclaims, exposing his undisclosed financial relationship with Agramax, seek sanctions against his attorney for filing frivolous suits, and document the broader pattern of corporate intimidation affecting Iowa farmers. "Sarah, we're not just defending your right to inherit this farm," Margaret explained as we finalized our legal strategy. "We're challenging a corporate land grab that threatens the future of family farming throughout the Midwest." The next morning brought another unexpected development when Tom Williams, a neighboring farmer in his 60s, stopped by with information that would prove crucial to our defense. Tom had been farming adjacent land for 30 years and had maintained a close friendship with Grandpa throughout that time. "Sarah, I heard about the legal trouble Marcus is causing you," Tom said as we stood on the farmhouse porch looking out over fields that stretched to the horizon. "I want you to know that your grandfather was one of the most knowledgeable and responsible farmers in this county. Anyone claiming he left you unprepared for agricultural operations doesn't know what they're talking about." Tom offered to serve as an expert witness in our legal defense, providing testimony about Grandpa's farming practices, my childhood involvement in agricultural work, and the excellent condition of the property's soil, drainage, and infrastructure. His support was particularly valuable because Marcus's lawsuit relied on portraying me as a completely inexperienced outsider who posed risks to the local farming community. "There's something else you should know," Tom continued, his expression growing serious. "Agramax has been approaching farmers throughout this area, making offers to purchase land at above market prices. They're particularly interested in properties with good soil and water access." He explained that several neighbors had been pressured to sell through a combination of generous financial offers and warnings about the challenges facing small-scale farming operations. Agramax representatives had been emphasizing the financial security and freedom from agricultural responsibilities that selling would provide, while downplaying the environmental and community impacts of corporate consolidation. "Your grandfather saw what was happening and was determined to keep his land out of corporate hands," Tom said. "He talked to me several times about his concern that Agramax would destroy everything he'd built if they got control of this property." That afternoon, Dr. Rodriguez returned with 2 additional university researchers who had been collaborating with Grandpa on his seed development program. Dr. James Morrison from the Soil Science Department and Dr. Lisa Park from the Plant Genetics Lab brought documentation that would be crucial for our legal defense. William Patterson was conducting some of the most innovative agricultural research in the Midwest, Dr. Morrison explained as we toured the greenhouse facilities. His soil management techniques have achieved carbon sequestration levels that commercial agriculture has been unable to replicate, while maintaining productivity that exceeds conventional farming methods. Dr. Park showed me detailed genetic analyses of Grandpa's varieties, revealing the sophisticated scientific work that had produced drought-resistant crops specifically adapted to Iowa's changing climate conditions. The research represented potential solutions to agricultural challenges that were affecting farmers throughout the region. "What your grandfather accomplished here couldn't be replicated quickly or easily," Dr. Park said. "The soil microbiome, seed genetics, and ecological relationships he developed represent 20 years of patient scientific work. If this land is converted to industrial agriculture, those resources would be lost permanently."
The university researchers agreed to provide expert testimony demonstrating that the farm was being operated according to the highest scientific and environmental standards, completely contradicting Marcus's claims about inexperienced management and potential risks to neighboring properties. But they also warned me about the escalating corporate pressure I could expect as Agramax realized that their legal strategy was being challenged effectively. Corporate land acquisition campaigns typically involved multiple tactics designed to overwhelm individual property owners with financial, legal, and social pressure. Sarah, you should be prepared for this situation to get more intense before it gets better, Dr. Rodriguez warned. Agramax has invested significant resources in acquiring agricultural land in this region, and they won't give up easily when they encounter resistance. That evening, as I sat in the farmhouse, surrounded by legal documents, scientific research, and testimony from neighbors who supported my inheritance, I realized that the battle for Grandpa's farm had become something much larger than a family dispute over property ownership. I was now fighting against a corporate system that viewed family farms as obstacles to be eliminated, rather than communities to be preserved. The scientific research Grandpa had conducted represented exactly the kind of innovative thinking that agriculture needed to address climate change and environmental degradation. But it also threatened corporate business models based on chemical dependency and genetic modification patents. The phone rang as I was processing these realizations, and Margaret's voice carried urgency that immediately got my attention. Sarah, I just received word that Agramax is planning to escalate their acquisition efforts. They're apparently frustrated by the legal challenges we've mounted, and they're considering more direct approaches. What kind of direct approaches? I asked, although I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. They're planning to make you a direct purchase offer, something substantial enough that refusing would seem financially irrational. They're also prepared to increase pressure on local government officials to support zoning changes that would make continued agricultural operations more difficult. The corporate escalation was both intimidating and clarifying. Agramax had revealed their true intentions and their willingness to use multiple pressure tactics to acquire land they wanted. But they had also underestimated my commitment to protecting what Grandpa had built and the strength of the community support I was receiving.
As I locked the farmhouse and checked the greenhouse security systems that Dr. Rodriguez had helped me install, I understood that the next phase of this battle would test everything I had learned about courage, determination, and the value of scientific work that served humanity rather than corporate profits. The war for the farm was entering its most dangerous phase, but I was no longer fighting alone. Agramax Corporation's generous offer arrived on a Wednesday morning, delivered not by mail, but by a black BMW sedan that looked completely out of place on the gravel roads surrounding my farm. The man who emerged wore an expensive suit and carried himself with the polished confidence of someone accustomed to making deals that others couldn't refuse. Richard Blackwood introduced himself as Agramax's Regional Acquisition Director, a title that sounded both impressive and ominous. His handshake was firm, his smile was practiced, and his eyes immediately began calculating property values and development potential as he surveyed the farmhouse and surrounding buildings. Miss Patterson, I want to begin by expressing Agramax's sincere condolences on your grandfather's passing, he said with rehearsed sympathy. William was a respected member of the agricultural community, and we understand that inheriting his property creates both opportunities and challenges for someone with your professional background. The condescending reference to my professional background was clearly intended to emphasize my supposed inexperience with farming, but Blackwood's tone was smooth enough that the insult was wrapped in apparent concern for my well-being and financial security. Mr. Blackwood, I appreciate your visit, but I should tell you up front that the farm isn't for sale, I said, maintaining politeness while making my position clear. My grandfather left me this property because he wanted it to remain in family hands and continue as working agricultural land. His smile never wavered, but something shifted in his eyes that suggested he'd expected resistance and had prepared accordingly.
Of course, Miss Patterson. Family sentiment is completely understandable, and Agramax respects the emotional attachments that come with inherited property. That's exactly why we've structured an offer that honors your grandfather's legacy while providing you with exceptional financial security. He opened a leather portfolio and withdrew documents that looked like they'd been prepared by teams of lawyers and financial analysts. The purchase offer was indeed substantial, $1.8 million for the property, equipment, and all agricultural assets, nearly double what Marcus had suggested the land was worth. This offer represents Agramax's commitment to preserving the agricultural character of your grandfather's property, he explained, spreading financial projections across the farmhouse kitchen table. We would maintain the existing crop rotations, preserve the historical buildings, and continue the sustainable farming practices that your grandfather pioneered. The promises sounded reasonable, even generous, but I remembered Margaret's satellite images showing what Agramax properties actually looked like after corporate acquisition. Their definition of sustainable farming practices apparently involved industrial monocultures and intensive chemical applications that bore no resemblance to Grandpa's methods. Mr. Blackwood, I'm curious about something, I said, studying the documents he'd presented. If Agramax is committed to preserving traditional farming methods, why do your other properties in this region look so different from what my grandfather was doing here? The question clearly caught him off guard, and for the first time his practiced composure slipped slightly. He recovered quickly, but not before I'd seen the flash of irritation that suggested he wasn't accustomed to having his corporate talking points questioned by inexperienced property owners. Each agricultural operation requires customized approaches based on soil conditions, market demands, and operational efficiency considerations, he replied smoothly. Agramax employs agricultural scientists and farming experts who determine the most appropriate methods for maximizing both productivity and environmental sustainability. It was a masterful non-answer that avoided addressing the contradiction between his promises about preserving Grandpa's methods and the obvious reality of Agramax's industrial farming practices. But his mention of agricultural scientists gave me an opening to probe deeper into what the corporation actually knew about the research being conducted on my property. That's interesting, I said, casually. Have your agricultural scientists identified anything unusual about the soil conditions or crop performance on this property? My grandfather always seemed to achieve yields that were higher than neighboring farms. Blackwood's eyes sharpened with genuine interest, confirming that Agramax had indeed been monitoring the farm's performance and was curious about the techniques that produced such exceptional results. His next words revealed just how much corporate research had been conducted without Grandpa's knowledge or consent. Our preliminary analyses have identified several factors that make this property particularly valuable for agricultural development, he said, pulling out soil surveys and satellite data documenting crop yields, soil health metrics, and water retention capabilities. Your grandfather's farming methods produced results that our scientists are eager to study and potentially replicate across other Agramax properties. The casual admission that Agramax had been conducting unauthorized surveillance of private property was shocking and legally problematic. More importantly, it confirmed that the corporation was specifically interested in acquiring Grandpa's research results, even though they had no understanding of the scientific work that had produced those results. Mr. Blackwood, I'm not comfortable with the idea that Agramax has been monitoring my grandfather's property without his permission, I said, allowing some of my anger to show through my polite facade. That kind of surveillance seems inappropriate and possibly illegal. He backpedaled quickly, claiming that satellite analysis and public agricultural data were standard research tools used throughout the industry. But his defensiveness confirmed that Agramax had been conducting more extensive surveillance than they were willing to admit publicly. Miss Patterson, perhaps we've gotten off on the wrong foot. Agromax's interest in this property is based purely on its agricultural potential and our commitment to preserving Iowa's farming heritage. Our offer represents a unique opportunity for you to honor your grandfather's memory while securing your own financial future.
He then outlined the full scope of Agromax's proposal, which included not just the $1.8 million purchase price, but also a consulting arrangement that would pay me $100,000 annually for 5 years to serve as an agricultural heritage advisor for the company's Iowa operations. This consulting position would allow you to maintain a connection to your grandfather's farming legacy, while Agromax implements the sustainable practices he developed, Blackwood explained. You would have input on farming decisions and environmental protection measures, ensuring that his innovations continue to benefit the agricultural community. The consulting offer was clearly designed to address my concerns about preserving Grandpa's work, while providing ongoing financial incentives that would discourage me from interfering with whatever Agromax actually planned to do with the property. It was a sophisticated form of bribery that would give me a financial stake in not asking uncomfortable questions about corporate farming practices. Mr. Blackwood, I appreciate the generous offer, but I need time to consider all the implications, I said, knowing that any delay would likely increase pressure tactics. This is obviously a major decision that affects not just my financial future, but also my grandfather's legacy. His response was swift and revealing. Of course, Ms. Patterson. However, I should mention that this offer has a limited time frame due to Agromax's development schedules and acquisition planning. We would need a decision within 2 weeks to maintain the current terms. The artificial deadline was a classic high-pressure sales tactic, designed to prevent me from conducting due diligence or seeking independent advice about the offer's true value. More significantly, it suggested that Agromax was operating under time pressures of their own, possibly related to the legal challenges Margaret was mounting against Marcus's lawsuit. After Blackwood left, I immediately called Margaret to report the corporate offer and the surveillance revelations. Her response was both concerned and strategically encouraging. Sarah, the fact that Agromax is making direct offers means they're worried about the legal challenges we filed. They're trying to bypass the lawsuit by creating financial pressure that would make fighting seem economically irrational. She explained that the $1.8 million offer was likely calculated to be just high enough to create serious temptation while remaining low enough to preserve Agromax's profit margins on eventual development or industrial farming conversion. The consulting arrangement is particularly problematic, Margaret continued. It's designed to buy your silence and cooperation while they implement farming practices that would destroy everything your grandfather built. Once you're financially dependent on Agromax, you would have no leverage to enforce the environmental promises they're making. That afternoon brought additional intelligence about Agromax's operations when Dr. Rodriguez arrived with disturbing information about the corporation's track record with sustainable farming promises. She'd been researching other properties where Agromax had made similar commitments to preserve traditional agricultural methods. Sarah, I need to show you what Agromax actually does after they acquire family farms, she said, spreading out aerial photographs taken at different time intervals. These images document the transformation of 3 different properties over the past 5 years. The photographs told a devastating story. Properties that had featured diverse crop rotations, wildlife habitats, and soil conservation measures were systematically converted to large-scale monocultures with obvious signs of environmental degradation. Hedgerows were eliminated, wetlands were drained, and intensive chemical applications had created the kind of ecological dead zones that characterized industrial agriculture. Every one of these properties was acquired with promises about preserving sustainable farming practices and respecting agricultural heritage. Agromax used those promises to overcome local opposition and regulatory scrutiny, then implemented industrial methods once they had legal control. She also brought documentation about the consulting arrangements that Agromax had offered to other property owners. In every case, the contracts had been terminated within 2 years, usually after the original owners raised concerns about environmental damage or violations of sustainability commitments.
The consulting positions are designed to neutralize opposition during the transition period. Once Agrimax has implemented their industrial farming systems, they eliminate the consulting arrangements and any pretense of honoring previous commitments. That evening, as I sat in the greenhouse surrounded by Grandpa's experimental plants and research journals, I realized that the corporate offer represented more than just a financial transaction. Agrimax was essentially asking me to betray everything Grandpa had worked for in exchange for money and false promises about preserving his legacy. The seed varieties growing around me represented solutions to agricultural challenges that could benefit farmers worldwide, but only if they remained protected from corporate exploitation and genetic modification patents. The soil health and ecological relationships that Grandpa had spent decades developing couldn't be replicated somewhere else or purchased with development profits. My phone rang as I was processing these realizations, and Tom Williams' voice carried urgency that immediately got my attention. "Sarah, I just heard through the farming community that Agrimax has been approaching other neighbors with purchase offers. They're apparently trying to acquire several properties in this area simultaneously." Tom explained that Agrimax was offering above-market prices to farmers throughout the county, creating financial pressure and community disruption that made individual resistance more difficult. If they could acquire enough adjacent properties, they could implement large-scale industrial farming that would make small-scale sustainable operations economically unviable. "They're not just trying to buy your farm, Sarah. They're trying to transform this entire agricultural region into corporate-controlled industrial production. Your grandfather's property is just the centerpiece of a much larger acquisition strategy." The revelation that I was fighting not just for my own inheritance, but for the preservation of an entire farming community added new weight to my decision about Agrimax's offer. Accepting their terms would contribute to the corporate consolidation that was destroying family farming throughout the Midwest.
As I locked the greenhouse and walked back to the farmhouse under a star-filled Iowa sky, I understood that the next 2 weeks would determine not just the fate of Grandpa's research and my own future, but the agricultural character of an entire region. Agrimax had revealed their true intentions through their surveillance, their acquisition strategy, and their track record of broken promises to other farm families. The generous offer and consulting arrangement were simply more sophisticated versions of the same predatory tactics they'd been using throughout Iowa. The corporate ultimatum was designed to make resistance seem financially irrational, but it had actually clarified my choice between honoring Grandpa's legacy and betraying everything he'd worked to protect. The decision ahead would require courage, but the path was clear. The morning after Agrimax's ultimatum, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of spending the 2-week deadline agonizing over their corporate offer, I would use that time to build a coalition powerful enough to stop their land grab permanently. If Agrimax wanted to fight, they were about to discover that they'd picked the wrong farm and the wrong family. My first call was to Dr. Rodriguez, who arrived within hours, accompanied by Dr. Patricia Hayes, the director of Iowa State University's Sustainable Agriculture Research Center. Dr. Hayes was a woman in her early 60s with the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of groundbreaking research and academic leadership. "Sarah, Dr. Rodriguez has briefed me on your grandfather's work, and I want you to understand that what he accomplished here represents a potential breakthrough in climate-adaptive agriculture," Dr. Hayes said as we toured the greenhouse facilities. The seed varieties he developed could help farmers survive increasingly unpredictable weather patterns while maintaining soil health and biodiversity. She explained that universities across the Midwest had been struggling to develop drought-resistant crops that didn't require genetic modification or patent restrictions. Grandpa's traditional breeding methods had achieved results that corporate laboratories had been unable to replicate, despite spending millions of dollars on research and development. If Agrimax acquires this property, they'll either destroy this research through industrial farming methods or attempt to patent your grandfather's innovations for corporate profit. Either outcome would be a devastating loss for sustainable agriculture and small-scale farming.
But Dr. Hayes had come with more than just scientific validation. She brought a proposal that could transform my defensive battle against corporate acquisition into an offensive strategy for protecting agricultural research and family farming throughout Iowa. The university is prepared to establish a formal research partnership that would designate your farm as an official agricultural innovation center, she explained, presenting documents that had clearly been prepared in advance. This designation would provide legal protections, ongoing funding, and scientific support while maintaining your ownership and control of the property. The research center designation would accomplish several strategic objectives simultaneously. It would provide legal documentation of the property's scientific value, making corporate acquisition attempts more difficult to justify. It would ensure ongoing funding for maintaining and expanding Grandpa's research program. Most importantly, it would create a model for protecting family farms with exceptional agricultural or environmental value. Sarah, this partnership would make your farm the flagship property for demonstrating that small-scale sustainable agriculture can outperform industrial methods in both productivity and environmental protection, Dr. Hayes said. You'd be helping to preserve not just Grandpa's legacy, but the future of family farming in the Midwest. That afternoon brought an unexpected visit from Maria Santos, an investigative journalist who covered agricultural policy for the Des Moines Register. She'd been tracking Agrimax's acquisition patterns and had connected the corporate pressure on my farm to a broader story about land consolidation and the destruction of rural communities. Miss Patterson, I've been investigating Agrimax's operations for over a year, and your situation represents exactly the kind of corporate overreach that's destroying family farming in Iowa. I'd like to tell your story as part of a larger exposé about predatory agricultural acquisition practices. Maria had documented Agrimax's systematic approach to acquiring family farms through a combination of legal pressure, financial manipulation, and false promises about preserving agricultural traditions. My case was particularly compelling because it involved university research, corporate surveillance, and family betrayal orchestrated by paid corporate agents. The public needs to understand how these corporations operate. They target properties with exceptional value, create artificial crises that force quick sales, then destroy everything that made those properties valuable in the first place. She proposed a series of articles that would document not just my fight against Agrimax, but the broader pattern of corporate land grabbing affecting farming communities throughout the Midwest. The media attention would create public pressure and political accountability that could help other farmers facing similar corporate intimidation. But Maria also warned me about the potential consequences of taking my fight public. Agrimax has significant political influence and deep pockets for legal battles. Once you challenge them publicly, they'll likely escalate their pressure tactics and attempt to discredit both you and your grandfather's research. That evening brought a community meeting that would prove crucial for building local support against Agrimax's acquisition strategy. Tom Williams had organized a gathering of neighboring farmers at the local Grange Hall, and the turnout exceeded everyone's expectations. More than 40 farmers, landowners, and community members packed the small building, representing families who had been working Iowa soil for generations. The demographic was diverse. Young farmers struggling to establish sustainable operations, middle-aged families dealing with economic pressures, and elderly couples worried about preserving agricultural land for their grandchildren. Folks, we all know why we're here, Tom began, addressing the crowd with the straightforward honesty that characterized rural communication. Agrimax Corporation has been buying up family farms throughout this county, and now they're targeting Sarah Patterson's property with the same tactics they've used against other farm families.
The stories that followed painted a devastating picture of corporate acquisition strategies designed to pressure individual farmers into selling land their families had worked for generations. Agrimax had been offering above-market prices while simultaneously creating legal and financial pressures that made selling seem like the only rational option. They came to us with promises about preserving our farming traditions, said Janet Morrison, whose family had sold their 150-acre farm to Agramax the previous year. Within 6 months, they'd ripped out every windbreak, drained the wetlands, and converted everything to corn monoculture with intensive chemical applications. Janet's husband Bob added details that revealed the systematic nature of Agramax's deception. They promised to maintain our organic certification and continue our crop rotation practices. Instead, they terminated our consulting arrangement after 8 months and implemented industrial farming methods that destroyed everything we'd spent 20 years building. The pattern was consistent across multiple properties. Generous initial offers, promises about preserving sustainable farming practices, consulting arrangements designed to neutralize opposition, and eventual conversion to industrial agriculture that maximized short-term profits while destroying long-term soil health and environmental quality. "The worst part is watching what happens to the land," said David Chen, a farmer whose property bordered an Agramax operation. "The soil erosion, chemical runoff, and loss of wildlife habitat affects everyone in the region, not just the properties they directly control." But the community meeting also revealed the strength of local support for fighting corporate acquisition. Farmer after farmer stood up to offer assistance, whether through expert testimony about sustainable farming practices, documentation of environmental damage from industrial agriculture, or simply community solidarity against corporate intimidation. "Sarah, your grandfather was one of the most respected farmers in this county," said elderly farmer Ruth Anderson. "If you're willing to fight Agramax, you've got the support of everyone who cares about preserving family farming and protecting our soil for future generations." The meeting concluded with the formation of the Rural Defense Coalition, a grassroots organization dedicated to helping family farmers resist corporate acquisition pressure. Tom Williams agreed to serve as coordinator, while Margaret Chen offered legal support for farmers facing frivolous lawsuits or regulatory challenges. "We're not just fighting for individual properties," Tom explained as the meeting wrapped up. "We're fighting for the survival of family farming and the preservation of rural communities that have sustained this region for generations." Over the following days, the coalition's formation generated momentum that surprised everyone involved. Local media picked up the story, agricultural organizations offered support, and even some politicians began asking questions about Agramax's acquisition practices and their impact on rural communities. The university partnership moved forward rapidly, with Iowa State formally designating my farm as the Patterson Agricultural Innovation Center within a week of Dr. Hayes' initial proposal. The designation came with immediate legal protections, ongoing research funding, and scientific credibility that would make Agramax's acquisition attempts much more difficult to justify. "Sarah, this partnership represents exactly the kind of collaboration between universities and family farmers that could revolutionize sustainable agriculture," Dr. Hayes said during the formal signing ceremony. "Your grandfather's research provides the foundation, but the Innovation Center will expand that work to benefit farming communities throughout the Midwest." The media attention surrounding the university partnership and community coalition caught Agramax off guard. Their acquisition strategy relied on isolating individual property owners and applying pressure through legal and financial channels that operated outside public scrutiny. The sudden spotlight on their practices created political and public relations challenges they hadn't anticipated. Richard Blackwood called repeatedly during this period, each conversation revealing increasing frustration with the resistance they were encountering. His initial polite offers gave way to thinly veiled threats about the consequences of refusing to negotiate. "Ms. Patterson, Agramax has been generous with both our financial offer and our timeline. However, our patience isn't unlimited, and there are other methods for acquiring properties that serve important agricultural development purposes." The implied threat was clear enough, but Blackwood's words were also being recorded with Margaret's permission as part of our legal documentation of corporate intimidation tactics. Every conversation provided additional evidence of the systematic pressure that Agramax applied to force property sales.
But the most significant development came when Maria Santos published her first article about Agramax's acquisition practices, featuring my story as the centerpiece of a broader investigation into corporate land grabbing. The article generated statewide attention and prompted other farmers to come forward with similar stories of corporate pressure and intimidation. Agramax's pursuit of the Patterson farm represents a troubling pattern of corporate acquisition that threatens the future of family farming in Iowa. The company's systematic approach to pressuring individual landowners raises serious questions about the concentration of agricultural land ownership and the preservation of rural communities. The article included interviews with multiple farmers who had faced similar pressure, documentation of Agramax's track record of broken promises, and expert analysis of the environmental and economic impacts of corporate land consolidation. The public response was immediate and overwhelmingly supportive of family farmers' rights to resist corporate acquisition. As the 2-week deadline approached, it became clear that Agramax's strategy had backfired spectacularly. Instead of isolating me and creating irresistible pressure to sell, their ultimatum had galvanized community opposition and attracted media attention that exposed their predatory practices to public scrutiny. The battle for my farm had become a symbol of the larger fight for family farming and sustainable agriculture, with implications that extended far beyond any individual property or inheritance dispute. Agramax wanted a quiet acquisition, but they got a very public fight that threatened to expose their methods throughout Iowa and beyond. The corporate deadline was approaching, but I wasn't facing it alone. I had university partnerships, legal support, community solidarity, and media attention that transformed a defensive battle into an offensive campaign for agricultural justice.
Agramax's ultimatum was about to expire, but the real fight was just beginning. The morning of Agramax's deadline arrived with an unexpected development that would expose the true depth of corporate corruption and family betrayal. Margaret Chen called at 6 a.m. with news that would change everything we thought we knew about Marcus's involvement with the corporate acquisition scheme. "Sarah, you need to see what we discovered during our investigation into Marcus's financial records," Margaret said, her voice carrying the excitement of someone who had uncovered smoking gun evidence. "This goes far beyond the consulting fee we already documented." She arrived an hour later with a thick folder containing bank records, corporate documents, and email communications that revealed Marcus hadn't just been paid by Agramax to file frivolous lawsuits. He had been working as their acquisition coordinator for over 2 years, systematically identifying family farms with vulnerable ownership situations and developing strategies for forced sales. "Marcus has been receiving monthly payments of $5,000 from Agramax since 6 months before your grandfather's death," Margaret said, spreading financial documents across the farmhouse kitchen table. "He's been operating as their inside agent, providing information about family dynamics, property values, and inheritance planning that help them target specific farms for acquisition." The email communications were particularly damning, revealing Marcus's role in gathering intelligence about Grandpa's health, financial situation, and estate planning decisions. He had been reporting regularly to Agramax executives about opportunities to pressure elderly farmers into selling their properties before inheritance transfers could complicate corporate acquisition efforts. "Here's the most disturbing part," Margaret continued, pointing to a series of emails dated from Grandpa's final months. "Marcus was actively encouraging Agramax to increase pressure on your grandfather, suggesting that his age and isolation made him vulnerable to financial manipulation and legal intimidation." One email thread showed Marcus providing detailed assessments of family members' likely responses to different pressure tactics, essentially creating psychological profiles that Agramax could use to optimize their acquisition strategies. He had described me as financially naive and emotionally attached to agricultural romanticism, predicting that I would be easily overwhelmed by corporate pressure and legal challenges. But Marcus had made a crucial miscalculation. His assessment had been based on his childhood perception of me as his academically successful but practically inexperienced younger cousin.
He had no understanding of the professional skills, determination, and community connections that would enable me to mount effective resistance against corporate intimidation. The financial records also reveal something else, Margaret said, pulling out banking documents that showed Marcus's recent spending patterns. He's been living well beyond his official income for the past 2 years, apparently counting on Agramax payments and expecting to receive a substantial bonus when your grandfather's farm was successfully acquired. Marcus had purchased a new truck, upgraded his apartment, and made investments that assumed continued income from his corporate agent work. The lifestyle inflation meant he was now financially dependent on Agramax's acquisition program, creating personal pressure to deliver results regardless of the ethical implications. Sarah, this documentation gives us everything we need to destroy Marcus's credibility and expose Agramax's systematic corruption. We can file criminal charges for fraud, conspiracy, and elder abuse while seeking civil damages for the emotional distress and financial harm they've caused. But before we could decide on legal strategy, Richard Blackwood arrived for what he clearly intended to be the final negotiation session. His black BMW was accompanied by a second vehicle carrying 2 additional Agramax executives, suggesting that the corporation was prepared to escalate their pressure tactics if I continued to refuse their acquisition offer. Blackwood's demeanor had changed significantly since our previous meeting. The polished charm and corporate courtesy had been replaced by barely contained frustration and implied threats that revealed Agramax's true character when their manipulation tactics failed to achieve desired results. Miss Patterson, our deadline expires today, and I need to be completely frank about the consequences of refusing Agramax's generous offer. Your decision affects not just your own financial future, but the economic development plans for this entire region. He spread out documents showing Agramax's acquisition map for the county, revealing that my farm was the centerpiece of a massive land consolidation project that would convert thousands of acres of family farming operations into industrial agricultural facilities. The scope was breathtaking and terrifying. An entire rural community would be transformed into corporate-controlled monoculture production. Agramax has invested significant resources in acquiring properties throughout this area, Blackwood continued, his tone carrying the implied threat of someone who expected compliance rather than negotiation. Your continued resistance is disrupting carefully planned development schedules and creating unnecessary complications for agricultural modernization efforts. The corporate executives who had accompanied Blackwood remained silent, but their presence was clearly intended to intimidate through numbers and implied authority. Their expensive suits and urban sophistication were meant to emphasize the futility of rural resistance against corporate power and financial resources. Miss Patterson, I appreciate Agramax's interest in this property, but my answer remains the same. The farm isn't sale, and no amount of pressure will change that decision. His response was swift and revealing. Miss Patterson, you should understand that Agramax has multiple methods for acquiring properties that serve important agricultural development purposes. If voluntary sale negotiations fail, there are regulatory and legal mechanisms that can achieve the same objectives. The threat was clear enough. Agramax was prepared to use amenity property proceedings, zoning challenges, and regulatory pressure to force acquisition of my property if direct purchase negotiations failed. The corporation had sufficient political influence and legal resources to pursue condemnation proceedings that would transfer ownership regardless of my personal preferences. That sounds like a threat, Mr. Blackwood. Are you suggesting that Agramax would use government power to steal private property for corporate profit?
The direct challenge clearly flustered Blackwood, who realized that his threats were being recorded and could be used as evidence of corporate corruption and abuse of government authority. His companions shifted uncomfortably, apparently recognizing that their intimidation session had become a legal liability. Agramax operates within all applicable laws and regulations, Blackwood replied defensively. Economic development projects sometimes require property consolidation that serves broader community interests beyond individual ownership preferences. But his retreat from explicit threats revealed that the corporation was concerned about legal exposure and public scrutiny. The media attention surrounding my case had created political risks that complicated their usual pressure tactics and made aggressive acquisition methods more difficult to implement without attracting unwanted attention. The meeting was interrupted by the arrival of Tom Williams, Dr. Rodriguez, and Maria Santos, who had apparently coordinated their timing to demonstrate the breadth of community support I had mobilized. Their presence transformed what Blackwood had intended as an isolated intimidation session into a public confrontation with multiple witnesses and documentation. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm Maria Santos from the Des Moines Register," Maria announced, pulling out her recording equipment. "I'm documenting Agrimax's acquisition practices in this region. Would you care to comment on the company's use of legal intimidation and regulatory pressure to force family farmers off their land?" Blackwood's reaction was immediate and telling. He gathered his documents quickly while instructing his companions to avoid making any statements to media representatives. The corporate executives who had appeared so confident and threatening moments before suddenly seemed desperate to escape public scrutiny and accountability. "Agrimax has no comment for media representatives," Blackwood said as he retreated toward his vehicle. "Our business negotiations are confidential matters between the corporation and individual property owners." But Dr. Rodriguez had one final revelation that would prove devastating to Agrimax's acquisition strategy. "Mr. Blackwood, before you leave, you should know that Iowa State University has officially designated this property as the Patterson Agricultural Innovation Center. Any attempt to acquire or disturb this facility would interfere with federally funded research programs." The news hit Blackwood like a physical blow. The university designation created legal protections and political complications that would make corporate acquisition extremely difficult, if not impossible. More importantly, it demonstrated that my resistance had gained institutional support that Agrimax couldn't easily intimidate or override. The research being conducted here has national significance for sustainable agriculture and climate adaptation. Congressional representatives and federal agencies are already monitoring this project as a model for university family farm partnerships. Tom Williams added the community perspective that completed the encirclement of corporate interests. "Mr. Blackwood, you should also know that the Rural Defense Coalition has documented Agrimax's broken promises to other farm families in this region. We're prepared to testify about corporate deception and environmental damage whenever regulatory hearings are conducted." The combination of federal regulatory protections, community organization, media attention, and legal documentation had created a perfect storm of opposition that Agrimax couldn't overcome through their usual pressure tactics. Blackwood's retreat was swift and complete, but his parting words revealed that the corporation wasn't prepared to abandon their acquisition efforts entirely. "This situation isn't resolved, Miss Patterson," he said as he climbed into his BMW. "Agrimax has significant resources and long-term development commitments that don't disappear because of temporary community opposition." After the Agrimax executives departed, Margaret arrived with additional documentation that would prove crucial for the legal battles ahead. Her investigation had uncovered evidence that Agrimax's acquisition program violated federal regulations protecting agricultural research and environmental conservation programs. "Sarah, the corporation's systematic targeting of research properties and sustainable farming operations appears to violate several federal statutes designed to protect agricultural innovation and environmental resources. We can file complaints with multiple agencies that have jurisdiction over corporate agricultural practices." The federal regulatory violations created opportunities for criminal prosecution and civil damages that would make Agrimax's acquisition costs far more expensive than they had anticipated. More importantly, federal intervention would provide protection that extended beyond my individual case to benefit other farming families facing similar corporate pressure. But the most satisfying development came when Marcus arrived that evening, clearly distraught and desperate to negotiate some kind of damage control for his exposed role as a corporate agent. His confident arrogance had been replaced by obvious fear about the legal and financial consequences of his betrayal. "Sarah, we need to talk," he said,
his voice carrying none of the manipulation and entitlement that had characterized our previous conversations. "I think I made some mistakes in my business relationship with Agrimax, and I need to figure out how to make things right with the family." His admission of mistakes was a dramatic understatement for systematic corporate espionage and family betrayal, but it also represented the beginning of accountability that could lead to cooperation with law enforcement investigations and civil litigation against Agrimax. "Marcus, the time for family negotiations is over," I replied, maintaining the firm boundary that Margaret had recommended. "Your business relationship with Agrimax created legal problems that require professional resolution through attorneys and law enforcement." As the day that had begun with Agrimax's ultimatum drew to a close, it became clear that the corporate acquisition strategy had failed completely. The deadline had passed without achieving any of their objectives, while my resistance had gained institutional support, media attention, and legal protections that made future pressure tactics extremely risky for the corporation. The battle for the farm had evolved from an inheritance dispute into a broader victory for family farming and agricultural research protection. Agrimax's systematic corruption had been exposed, Marcus's betrayal had been documented, and the community coalition had demonstrated that corporate intimidation could be defeated through organization, legal advocacy, and public accountability. But victory came with the understanding that the fight for agricultural justice would continue beyond my individual case, requiring ongoing vigilance against corporate predators who viewed family farms as obstacles to be eliminated rather than communities to be preserved.
6 months after Agrimax's failed acquisition attempt, I stood in the same greenhouse where I'd first discovered Grandpa's revolutionary seed research, but everything had changed. The space now bustled with activity from university researchers, graduate students, and visiting farmers who came to learn about sustainable agriculture techniques that were gaining recognition nationwide. The Patterson Agricultural Innovation Center had become exactly what Dr. Hayes had envisioned, a living laboratory that demonstrated how family farms could outperform industrial agriculture while protecting environmental resources and developing climate-resilient crops. The research program had expanded beyond Grandpa's original work to include soil carbon sequestration studies, pollinator habitat restoration, and water conservation techniques that other farming operations were beginning to implement across the Midwest. Dr. Rodriguez arrived that morning with news that would have made Grandpa incredibly proud. "Sarah, the USDA has officially recognized 3 of your grandfather's seed varieties as exceptional agricultural innovations, eligible for federal research grants and farmer distribution programs," she announced, carrying documentation that represented the culmination of decades of patient scientific work. The federal recognition meant that Grandpa's drought-resistant corn and soil-improving soybean varieties would be available to farmers throughout regions affected by climate change while remaining protected from corporate patents that would restrict access or increase costs. His innovations would benefit the agricultural community exactly as he had intended, rather than enriching corporate shareholders who contributed nothing to their development. The preliminary field trials conducted by the Innovation Center have demonstrated yield improvements of 15 to 20% compared to conventional varieties, even under drought conditions, Dr. Rodriguez continued. Farmers in 12 states have requested access to these seeds for next year's planting season. But the success of the research program was only part of the transformation that had occurred since defeating Agrimax's acquisition attempt. The Rural Descents Coalition had evolved into a statewide organization that provided legal support, technical assistance, and political advocacy for family farmers facing corporate pressure throughout Iowa and neighboring states. Tom Williams had emerged as a natural leader for the coalition, using his practical farming experience and community connections to help other agricultural families navigate legal challenges and resist predatory acquisition tactics. The organization had successfully defended 8 family farms from corporate takeover attempts while documenting systematic patterns of abuse that had prompted state legislative investigations. "Sarah,
We've got farmers from 3 counties coming to next week's coalition meeting, Tom reported during his weekly update on grassroots organizing efforts. Word is spreading about the legal strategies and community support systems that can help family farmers stay on their land. The media attention that began with Maria Santos's investigation had continued to expand, generating national coverage of corporate agricultural practices and the resistance movements that were challenging land consolidation throughout rural America. Maria's follow-up articles had prompted congressional hearings about antitrust violations in agricultural markets and the need for stronger protections for family farming operations. Your story has become a symbol for agricultural justice movements across the country, Maria told me during her latest visit to document the Innovation Center's progress. Farm families in 7 states have contacted me about organizing similar resistance efforts against corporate land grabbing. The political impact had been substantial and lasting. State legislators had introduced bills strengthening protections for agricultural research facilities and family farming operations, while federal agencies had launched investigations into corporate acquisition practices that violated antitrust and environmental protection laws. But perhaps the most satisfying development was the legal reckoning that had finally caught up with both Marcus and Agrimax Corporation. Margaret Chen's thorough documentation of corporate corruption had provided prosecutors with evidence for criminal charges that would have serious consequences for everyone involved in the acquisition conspiracy. Marcus's cooperation with law enforcement investigations had been extensive and revealing, exposing the systematic nature of Agrimax's predatory practices and the sophisticated methods they used to pressure family farmers into selling valuable agricultural properties. His testimony had been crucial for building cases against corporate executives who believed their wealth and political connections would protect them from legal accountability. Marcus is facing federal charges for conspiracy, fraud, and elder abuse, Margaret reported during our final legal strategy meeting. His cooperation with prosecutors might reduce his sentence, but he's looking at significant prison time and financial penalties that will eliminate any benefit he received from his corporate agent work. The federal investigation against Agrimax executives had been even more severe, including violations of federal racketeering statutes that applied to organized schemes for acquiring property through intimidation and fraud. Richard Blackwood and 2 other regional directors were facing decades in federal prison, while the corporation itself faced massive fines and court-ordered changes to their acquisition practices. The federal investigation has revealed that Agrimax was systematically targeting family farms with exceptional agricultural or environmental value, using legal intimidation and financial manipulation to force sales that never would have occurred through legitimate market negotiations, Market explained. The scope of their criminal enterprise was far larger than any of us realized. The civil litigation had been equally devastating for Agrimax, with damage awards that totaled over $50 million for the family farms that had been victims of their predatory practices. The financial penalties had forced significant changes in corporate leadership and business practices, while establishing legal precedents that would protect other agricultural families from similar abuse. More importantly, the court proceedings had resulted in the return of several family farms that had been acquired through fraud or intimidation. Janet and Bob Morrison had regained ownership of their property, along with substantial damages for the environmental restoration required to repair the damage from industrial farming practices. Getting our farm back has been like getting our lives back, Janet told me during the celebration gathering that marked the first anniversary of our victory over Agrimax. We never thought we'd be able to undo the damage from signing that sale contract, but the legal precedents your case established made it possible.
The anniversary celebration was held at the Innovation Center with over 200 people gathering to honor Grandpa's memory and celebrate the broader agricultural justice movement that had grown from defending his legacy. The attendees included farmers, researchers, journalists, attorneys, and political representatives who had all played roles in protecting family farming and sustainable agriculture.
Dr. Hayes delivered remarks that placed our local victory in the context of national agricultural policy and environmental protection. The Patterson Agricultural Innovation Center represents a new model for university-community partnerships that can help agriculture adapt to climate change while preserving family farming traditions, she said. William Patterson's research has provided solutions that benefit farmers throughout the region, while Sarah's leadership has demonstrated that corporate intimidation can be defeated through community organization and legal advocacy. The economic impact had been remarkable and continuing to grow. The Innovation Center had generated over $2 million in research grants and economic activity for the local community, while the sustainable farming techniques being developed and demonstrated had helped neighboring farmers reduce costs and improve yields. Property values for family farms in the region had increased significantly as the area gained recognition for agricultural innovation and environmental protection. But the personal transformation had been equally profound. I had evolved from a marketing professional with limited agricultural knowledge into someone who could manage complex research programs, navigate political advocacy, and lead community organizing efforts that protected family farming throughout the region. Sarah, you've become the person your grandfather always believed you could be, my mother said during a quiet moment at the anniversary celebration. He saw qualities in you that none of us fully appreciated, and his trust has been vindicated in ways that exceed anything he could have imagined. The farmhouse had been renovated to accommodate the expanded research and education activities while maintaining the historical character that honored 3 generations of Patterson family farming. The space now included modern laboratory facilities, conference rooms for hosting agricultural workshops, and guest accommodations for visiting researchers and farmers who came to learn about sustainable farming innovations. As the celebration continued into the evening, I found myself in the greenhouse where this entire journey had begun, surrounded by the experimental plants that represented Grandpa's life work and the continuing research that would benefit future generations of farmers. The seed varieties that had once been hidden secrets were now contributing to agricultural solutions that addressed climate change, soil degradation, and food security challenges affecting communities worldwide. Dr. Rodriguez joined me among the carefully tended research plots, both of us reflecting on the transformation that had occurred since that first morning when I discovered containers of mysterious seeds beneath hay bales in the old barn. Your grandfather would be amazed by what his research has accomplished, she said, examining corn plants that were thriving despite the drought conditions affecting much of Iowa. But I think he'd be even more proud of the leadership you've shown in protecting family farming and building communities that support agricultural innovation. The evening concluded with the dedication of a memorial garden that honored Grandpa's memory while celebrating the agricultural justice movement that had grown from defending his legacy. The garden featured native plants that supported pollinators essential for crop production, along with interpretive displays that explained the connection between sustainable farming practices and environmental protection. As the last guest departed and I locked the greenhouse for the night, I realized that inheriting Grandpa's farm had given me far more than land, buildings, and research materials. It had provided a mission that connected my professional skills with meaningful work that benefited farming communities and protected environmental resources for future generations. The battle against Agrimax had ended with complete victory for family farming and agricultural justice, but the real legacy was the ongoing work of the Innovation Center and the broader movement for sustainable agriculture. Grandpa's trust in my character and capabilities had been vindicated through results that exceeded anything he could have imagined when he wrote his final letter explaining the hidden treasures I would discover in his barn. Standing on the farmhouse porch under a star-filled Iowa sky, I understood that the inheritance I'd received wasn't just property or research materials. It was the responsibility and privilege of stewarding land and knowledge that could help feed the world while protecting the environment. The farm that Marcus had tried to steal and Agrimax had attempted to destroy had become a symbol of hope for family farming and a model for agricultural practices that served humanity rather than corporate profits. The war for the farm was over, but the work of building a more just and sustainable agricultural system would continue for generations to come.
Grandpa's legacy was secure, and his vision of farming that honored both land and community had found expression through institutions and movements that would protect family agriculture long into the future. The compass he'd left me still pointed true north, and the direction ahead remained clear, continuing the work of farming, research, and advocacy that proved family operations could outperform corporate agriculture while building communities that valued justice, sustainability, and hope for future generations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.